Hi everybody. Well, today we are continuing with our series on Haggai, and it's entitled Returning and Rebuilding. And we're going to be looking again at Haggai chapter 2, verse 1 to 9. It is such a rich passage. We could preach through it over a number of weeks, but I just want to look at it again this week. I'm not going to have a chance to read through it. I'm going to leave that to you to do in order to save time on this particular video. But please read through Haggai chapter 2, verse 1 through to 9. But to give you a brief summary of what we've heard so far as we've gone through Haggai. In chapter 1, we've seen that the exiles, because they've been distracted with their own lives and become focused on their own worlds, they had put God to the periphery, and the result was that they had stalled and stopped in their building initiative. The thing that God wanted to build. And the prophet Haggai speaks into that in chapter 1. In chapter 2, it's not so much that they've been distracted with their own lives, but the exiles run the risk of being disappointed or disillusioned with what they are building because they are comparing it to the past. And what Haggai does is he speaks to them and he encourages them and says that actually what God is building through them is going to be far greater than what King Solomon's temple was like. But what they need to do is to, in the present, build with eyes of faith because God is with them. So that is a bit of a brief summary. And what I wanted to do today is I want to look at 3 points from this text which can relate or do relate to our own return as a church out of all the aspects of lockdown, and we return to a normality in a world that has changed. And I've entitled today's message, A Tale of Two Temples. Well, the first thing I want to mention, my first point, is don't look back. Now, on the 8th of May, it was 26 years since Michelle and myself arrived here in the United Kingdom. So we've been here for 26 years, and what a blessing, because we love London and we love this nation. And in those 26 years, there have been moments where I have missed the land of my birth. But for myself, I can honestly say I've never longed to return there, partly because I love this country and because it's my home. And I feel called to this place. And until I hear otherwise, I'm not going anywhere. But there's another reason for this. Is that pretty early on, after Michelle and myself had moved here to the United Kingdom, I realized that when I missed South Africa for myself, speaking for myself here, what I was really missing was a time and a place in my life. Being with my best mate in his VW, driving down to the beach, singing Bob Marley, and I realized that there was no way that I was ever going to be able to recreate the past. I was never going to be 19 again. I was never going to have a fringe again. And I was never going to have absolutely zero responsibilities. And any attempt to try and recreate the past or to go back to the past would be crazy and foolish and indeed unhealthy and prevent me from living in the present and into the future that God had for me. When I realized that, it meant that I no longer lived with one foot in the past and one foot in the future. And in Haggai chapter 2, verse 1 to 9, the exiles are faced with something of this question. Do they look back at King Solomon's temple, the temple of the past? Or do they seek to embrace the temple of the present, the one that they're building, and choose to look at it through the future promises that God had given them? What will they do? Well, will they be preoccupied with the beauty of the past and what had happened and in so doing get stuck? Because that's what happens when we get preoccupied with the past, we get stuck there. Or will they choose to look at the ruins that they're among and the building that they have to do and the dust and the schedules they have to organize and the ordinariness of that? Will they choose to look at that with eyes of faith and with the promises of the future? The past can be quite a seductive idol in our lives, particularly when things get difficult and when things, when we feel ourselves squeezed. We long for the comfort and familiarity of what was. And we see that in a number of places in the Bible, but a well-known example is with the Israelites when they leave Egypt, just being saved from slavery, and things start to get a little bit tough as they leave Egypt, and suddenly they say, "Oh, we long for the garlic, leeks, and onions of Egypt." And suddenly they turn what was a very ordinary food in their imagination, they turn it into the feast of kings. It was so much better in those days. But the reality of this is that when we walk with Jesus, when we take his hand and we walk with him into the future, it can be uncomfortable at times. It can be inconvenient. The future is not always as clear or as clearly defined as we would like. And it requires a lot of letting go. But yet, it's in walking with him that we find the real treasure. It's with walking with him now and into the future that we find the real treasure, not by clinging to the past. In Philippians chapter 3, verse 13 to 14, the Apostle Paul says this: "Forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead, I press on towards the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus." Now, how does this relate to us as a church? Well, the last year and a bit has seen some amazing developments for us as a church, particularly in relation to our work within the community. And that is certainly something that we want to build on and making a more central part of ourselves as Kingsgate Church. That doesn't mean that Kingsgate is going to radically change, but it does mean that certain things are going to be different. And one of the things that I'm aware of is that within this COVID crisis, that there have been a fair few people within the Kingsgate Church community who haven't seen what's been taking place, or haven't been able to, or haven't engaged in the work that we have been doing within the community. The COVID crisis in some ways has caused us to be spun out of the orbit of church community and get stuck in our own worlds a bit. So we, as we all come back together as Kingsgate Church, are we going to be happy about leaving the comfort and the familiarity of our own worlds and begin to embrace being a community together on mission? Even if that means we're going to be seeing a lot of new faces and some old faces that are no longer there, even though the building is going to look a little bit different, even though that there are now going to be initiatives which are important to Kingsgate that you may be a little bit unfamiliar with, even though there may be some inconvenience and it might be a little bit uncomfortable, will we embrace this mission to make a difference to our world around us? And I've been thinking a little bit about this as I've reflected on our return as a church community to our Sunday morning meetings, our in-person Sunday morning meetings, which I'm hoping to do from June. Because if you've not been to the Kingsgate venue, you're going to walk in and it's going to look a bit different. There's boxes in the auditorium, there's less space, there's some fridge freezers in the lobby, there's workstations that are out there where people are doing cooking. And then when you combine that with the fact that at least initially there are going to be some restrictions on what it means to meet together on a Sunday morning, some restrictions regarding singing, and even some of our kids ministry stuff is not going to be as developed as it was prior to lockdown and to 16 months ago. And it'd be easy to walk into that space and think, oh, this is difficult. This is not like it used to be. Oh, it was so much better 15, 16 months ago. But I'm asking you to please not look at our Sunday meetings or any part of Kingsgate Church through the lenses of the past, but rather through the lenses of what he is doing with us now and the promises of the future. Do not let the past be the lens, but rather the promises that God has for us. Because when we do that, we will embrace what he is doing, even if it is difficult and uncomfortable at times. So don't look back. The second point I want to make is that the temple is a temple for the world. Now, The first temple the Solomon's temple that was built was glorious and magnificent and was incredibly ornate. And, you look at it, it was, this was so inspiring. But it was ultimately a temple about Israel and God. And this new temple that God speaks about in Haggai chapter 2, what Haggai says is that this new temple is going to far exceed the old temple of Solomon. And the glory of the latter temple will far outstrip the former. And this second temple, this new temple, the one that doesn't look as impressive right now, is not about Israel and God, but about the world and God. A far, far bigger reach and bigger impact. I'm convinced that within all of us as Christians, there is a bent towards becoming insular, and church becoming insular about us, about our needs, what we like, what we find comfortable, about my experience. Church can become about what am I experiencing? And it takes a conscious effort for us to change that bias that we have, and indeed that change that dangerous bias that we have, and to turn our gaze away from ourselves and to the world around us. About 5 or 6 years ago, it was actually 2015, I was getting off a bus one evening and I felt God say to me, "You've done well in celebrating your past, but now it is time to celebrate your future." And at the time when I felt God give me those words, I'd been praying. I'd been praying that we as Kingsgate Church would be a church that really impacted the city around us. That we would not be a church that had an amazing Sunday meeting and great experiences for the congregation, but yet had absolutely no footprint or relationship with the city. I said, Lord, please let that not be the case. Because I think it's a terrifying thing for a church to be present in a community, to worship and to exist, but for the community around it to have no idea that it is even there. I prayed that we would be a church that increasingly reflected and represented the people who made up Kingston, the borough in which we are planted. And I prayed that we would, like the abbeys of old, be a place where the community came for both spiritual and practical needs. That we, like those abbeys of old, would be a place which causes the community to thrive. So we prayed about this. There were prophetic words that we received that confirmed this. And in 2021, today, we are standing in the fruit of that and the reality of that, and with opportunities for even more. The last year has seen us actively love our community in a way which has exceeded my expectations, and the city itself inviting us to love and care for it. Our biggest challenge is deciding what not to do, because such are the needs and the opportunities that are coming our way. Secondly, we have people coming into our building and coming into the orbit and influence of the church who would never have stepped inside of a church beforehand. And they do that because they feel loved and they feel safe. And maybe, just wonderfully, they believe that something of Kingsgate is part of their space as well. And then the other thing which has happened is there's been a significant change in people's openness to spiritual conversations and spiritual things. And this can happen in the time of a crisis. But there's a lady in our church who's an amazing evangelist who was sharing with Michelle and myself how she has just found it so much easier to talk to people about spiritual things. As awful as this crisis has been, and it has been for many, many people, the result of the last 14, 15 months is that in relation to the dream we have for this church and the prophetic words that have been spoken over her, we are years ahead of what I have expected. The door has been flung wide open. What will we do? Because this is not just for 2, 3, 4, or 5 people who call Kingsgate Church home, but it is for all of us. Because every single one of you has a part to play, big and in small ways. In this passage today, when Haggai brings his prophetic word, he speaks to Zerubbabel, he speaks to Joshua, but then he also speaks to all you people, because all you people are included in the rebuilding. And in a way, as important, or maybe even at times more important than what we actually do, is the posture of our hearts. For us as a church to recognize that we do not exist for ourselves, but that we exist for others. One of the big messages of the book of Haggai is that our decisions matter. That one of the ways in which God works through his creation is through the obedience of his people. And that's an incredible privilege, that God would condescend to use us and in some ways partner with us in what he is doing. But there is also a sobering responsibility, because it means that if God's people do not respond, do not embrace, do not lay hold of the promises and the future that God promises, that the community suffers, the world around suffers as a result of that. So Kingsgate, we have a moment in the weeks and the months ahead to choose how we are going to respond to this open door. It's going to involve us consciously resisting the temptation to comfort, the temptation to convenience and to self. And the best way for us to do that is to be overwhelmed by the glory of the gospel and what Jesus has done for us. Jesus who left the glory of heaven to take on human flesh, to die on a cross for us. Talk about inconvenience. Talk about uncomfortable. Yet Jesus willingly did that for us because he wanted us to share in his kingdom. Surely we should imitate him in that as we view and look at and love the world around us. The third point I want to make is the fact that the temple that we're building is the one where God is present. Now, when the exiles looked at Solomon's temple, they could have thought, oh, remember those ceremonies we used to have. Remember when God was present with us in that old, glorious, magnificent temple, the way we used to do things. And yet what we see here is that God says to them that in this passage, he says, my spirit remains with you in the midst of this building, in the midst of the awkwardness and the mundanity at times, the ordinariness of rebuilding this temple. I am with you. My spirit is there with you in the dust, etc., etc. God wasn't present with them. God was no longer present in the temple of the past, but he was present in the new thing that he was doing. God wasn't present in the temple of the past, but he was present in the new thing he was doing. So, as we go forward, as we return from the lockdown and the last 16 months, this is what my desire is that we expect and enjoy God's presence, certainly in our Sunday gatherings, even if they're a little bit awkward, uncomfortable, and inconvenient, because none of that matters if our hearts are ready to enjoy his presence. Secondly, not only to expect and enjoy his presence as we meet together on a Sunday, but as we pack bright boxes or we serve and befriend people in the sisterhood sanctuary that we're doing, or any of the other things that we are working with as we love our community around us. And also to expect and enjoy his presence with us as we go to our workplaces, our schools, our boardrooms, or Zoom calls, whatever it might be. Because this is what I'm trying to say, is that the Spirit of God cannot be contained by a memory or by four walls. It is exploding into the world through a people who have God's heart. And that is our desire. So the 3 points I want us to take away from today. First of all, don't look back. Secondly, the temple that God is building is not about our own little world and our comfort, but it is a temple he's building for the world, and he desires for us to look outward. And then thirdly, that God is present with us as we meet, as we serve, as we love, as we go to our workspace, that he is present with us and he cannot be contained by a memory or four walls, but he is desiring to explode into this world through a people who carry his own heart. May the Lord bless you and keep you and turn his face to shine upon you.